rather than a chemical imbalance in the way our brains are actually working?
Well, one of the inferences we can make from these big changes being so rapid and recent is that it can't be genetic changes. It can't be driven by our basic biological makeup. So there must be something else happening, and it must be environmental changes that have driven that. I mean, clearly it could be that people are just recognizing depression that was always there, but now they're recognizing it more. But the fact that both clinical studies and epidemiological studies show up the same thing argues that it's not just that people are recognizing it better, because you control for the sort of questions you can ask and check that the questions asked are the same over those decades. But the other thing is that we know that after about 1977, you got increases in changing rates of suicide as well, especially in young men. Right the way over the Western world, you got increases in the suicide rate, which to some extent mimicked this younger and younger depression hitting. Now that's stabilized over the last few years, but the fact that you get really confirmation from another area that we know is likely to have been affected by this changing pattern of depression, I think, shows that something's going on here. It's very difficult to understand exactly what the causes are. Changing patterns of society, the increase in the gap between rich and poor, the fact that when economies develop rapidly, often there seem to be some almost unavoidable changes in the gaps between rich and poor. We know that in the countries that have the least gaps between rich and poor, then the levels of stress, the levels of trust even within the communities are higher, the levels of hope are higher, and people tend to live longer in those societies. So there are little bits of evidence that people are beginning to put together to suggest what the changes might have been. But what we're working on are treatments that and approaches which can now deal with this depression epidemic.
If you had to choose fundamental driving forces behind depression, what would they be?
Well, at the individual level, they're the way we think about life. So where we feel we are, as it were, in relation to other people, in relation to our own standards and the standards that other people set for us. So one of the ways in which society is changing is the way in which it expects us to do things, the targets it sets for us and so on. And when society sets us targets and says, meet those or else, then the best you can hope for from your work is relief when you've met your targets. In other words, if you could do a good job and feel pleased that you've done a good job because of your work, you know, if you're a heart surgeon and you've saved, you know, several lives this week, then that must be a really good sense of worth about what you've done. But what happens if you've got a target to save 6 lives this week? All you do is when you've saved 6 lives is think, oh, thank goodness that I've met my targets. You know? So suddenly it turns the possibility of satisfaction with a job well done into relief that you haven't made a mistake. So you've turned potentially something really enjoyable about life into a thing that isn't going to, as it were, give you the motivation. So gradually that can work for a while, you know, but gradually it can eat away, I think, at you in ways that are a bit pernicious.
So how could you, for example, you know, if you were an omnipotent dictator, how could you change society? Or, you know, perhaps if you were running a company, how could you change the culture of that company or of that society to actually promote mental health and well-being?
I think it's, well, people talk about work-life balance, don't they? And that's really important. It also to recognize that productivity needs engagement, and engagement needs a sense of control, a sense of choices. So as you go down companies, traditionally you get people having less and less choice about what they do, and if you can find a way to increase the choice, then you naturally increase the creativity. We know that when a company is run on just target lines and so on in this stressful way, that actually people, in order to meet their targets, they feel very stressed, they put in more hours, but they aren't necessarily more productive because they're not seeing the whole picture. And if you want employers to see the whole picture, And if we want us in our family life to see the whole picture, then you have to learn to attend, and you have to learn to see the whole picture by reducing stress. And there are things we can do about that. And mindfulness, which is what I've spent much of my life researching over the last 20 years, is one of the answers to that.
Does depression inevitably return, or is it possible to just have one episode of depression and that's it for the rest of your life? You get over it, you dust yourself down and carry on with the rest of your life. Is that possible, or does it tend to return?
Okay, depression can be a one-off, and so it's not inevitable to return. So it's a bit of a message of hope. If we said, oh, it's always going to return, then it's a counsel of despair for many people. On the other hand, if you've been depressed once, you do have a slightly increased threshold, and it rather depends why you got depressed. If you got depressed because of a big life event, for example, bereavement, unemployment, separation, the sort of reasons that would make any of us low, then so long as you don't have a repeat of those sort of events, then you're not necessarily going to get depressed again. But the problem is that if you get depressed, the threshold for you getting depressed again is slightly altered. And if then you get depressed for a second time, what we know is the triggers of a third depression are less. So for example, you might need bereavement or unemployment the first time you get depressed. The second time it might be something slightly less of a stressor, but then the third, fourth time, then you may not need a stressor at all. By the time actually you've had 3, 4, 5 depression, it may be that you just wake up one morning feeling a bit low, and by the end of the day you're feeling very depressed. So the statistics suggest that about 50% of people might have a one-off episode and then it doesn't bother them again. But if they've been depressed twice, the chances to get depressed again are much higher, 3 times, and the rates are about 70 to 80%. And in our studies we find, for example, that if we follow people up for about 12 months without offering any treatment to them, then if they've had 3 depressions in the past before they've come to see us, then between 60 and 80% of them will get depressed again in those next 12 months.
So people who become repeatedly depressed year after year, what proportion of their lives do they actually spend in that depressed state?
Well, we didn't know the answer to this question until fairly recently, and there's some researchers in the States who've done a long-term follow-up of a study called the NIMH, that's the National Institute for Mental Health. They started a study in 1975, and because they were able to keep in touch with this large number of people that started then, they were able to look at how much time do people actually spend depressed if they've been repeatedly depressed. And the figures are staggering. What they found was, and it's just been published in the last couple of years, is that people on average spend 32% of their time in episode over the 20-year period. So on average, 4 months a year are spent in episodes of depression, which, I mean, considering the burden that we talked about earlier, it's an incredible statistic.
That's a really disturbing statistic. What proportion of people then go on to begin self-harm or even commit suicide?
There are changing rates of self-harm and suicidal behaviour, and the definitions vary. So self-harm sometimes mean people who harm themselves physically, cutting themselves and so on. Deliberate self-harm is sometimes broader than that, people that take overdoses and so on. And we know that the rates of suicide in people who've been seriously depressed are elevated compared with the general population. Now, about 1% of the population die by suicide anyway. If you've been depressed in the past, that's likely to be higher, about 4 or 5%. If you've been depressed and been an inpatient at some point in your life and been hospitalised for depression, it can be as high as 10 to 15%. So 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people die by suicide if they've been inpatient and hospitalised for depression. But of course it's not inevitable. Most people don't die in this way.